During the Cold War, right in the heart of Europe, one country dared to dream that communism could be different. It was this incredible, hopeful period called the Prague Spring. But that dream was crushed, and the way it ended sent shockwaves around the globe. So let's get into this story of hope, reform, and brutal suppression.
I want to start with this quote because it just grounds you right in the moment. This isn't about grand politics. It's about what it felt like on the street. Can you imagine seeing a soldier, supposedly a friend, show up in your city uninvited? The journalist said they looked like they were from a movie about Stalingrad, totally convinced they were there to stop World War III. It just captures the absurdity and the tragedy of it all.
So how did it even get to this point? Well, to really get the invasion, you first have to understand the incredible hope that came right before it. It all kicked off with this amazing period of optimism. The big idea, the phrase everyone was buzzing about, was socialism with a human face. Now, this wasn't about getting rid of communism, not at all. It was about changing it from the inside. The new leader, Alexander Dubček, started easing up on censorship, allowing for more open debate and tweaking the economy. And the people? They were absolutely thrilled. After years of super strict Soviet-style control, this felt like a breath of fresh air. But, while everyone in Prague was celebrating, Moscow was watching, and they were getting really nervous. They didn't see this new openness as a good thing. To them, it looked like a direct threat to the entire Soviet system.
And this is really the heart of the conflict. You've got Dubček on one side telling the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, hey, don't worry, we're still your allies, we're staying in the Warsaw Pact. But Brezhnev, on the other hand, is looking at this and seeing a total nightmare. He's thinking, if Czechoslovakia can do this, what's stopping Poland or Hungary from trying the same thing? And his worst-case scenario, if they leave the pact, suddenly NATO is right on the Soviet Union's doorstep.
And the pressure on Brezhnev wasn't just in his own head. You had these old-school, hardline leaders in places like East Germany and Poland practically begging him to step in. They were terrified these new, free-thinking ideas would spread to their own countries. Plus, there was a growing fear that Czechoslovakia was getting a little too friendly with West Germany. But the real clincher? A group of Czech hardliners actually sent a secret letter to Moscow, basically inviting them to invade and save communism from their own countrymen. So Brezhnev made his decision. The time for talking was over. On August 20th, 1968, the tanks rolled in and that hopeful dream was crushed. Just look at that number. Let it sink in for a second. 500,000 soldiers. That's the size of the Warsaw Pact army that flooded into Czechoslovakia. This wasn't a small operation. It was a massive, overwhelming display of power, designed to completely snuff out any idea of fighting back. And this is where things get almost surreal. The huge gap between the official story and what was actually happening. Soviet propaganda was telling the world they'd been invited to help out. But the soldiers on the ground, they were completely shocked. They expected to be welcomed as heroes, but instead they were met with angry, hostile crowds everywhere they went. They had been totally lied to. And you can just feel the shock and betrayal in this official radio broadcast from Prague. Just imagine hearing this. Your own government is announcing that its so-called allies have invaded without anyone even telling them. They're calling it a violation of the very idea of friendship between communist states. Just unbelievable. So what do you do? Well, the Czech army was ordered to stay in their barracks to avoid a massive bloodbath. So it was up to regular people, and they resisted in any way they could. Students tore down street signs to confuse the invaders. Protesters stood in front of tanks, arguing with the soldiers. It was brave, but ultimately futile. And while it was tragic, the fact that fewer than 100 people were killed in that initial push is actually pretty remarkable, all things considered. Okay, so you've just invaded one of your allies. You need a really good excuse, right? Well, Moscow came up with a whole new policy to justify it, and it would define life in Eastern Europe for the next 20 years. I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? How do you possibly explain this to the world, and more importantly, to the other countries in your bloc? The answer was, you just change the rules of the game. And here it is, the Brezhnev Doctrine. Put simply, it meant that countries in the Eastern Bloc weren't really independent. Their sovereignty only existed as long as Moscow was okay with it. If your country's actions were seen as a threat to the security of the whole group, the Soviet Union claimed the right to step in. Your internal business was now their business. This quote from the official Soviet newspaper Pravda lays out the thinking perfectly. It basically says that being responsible to your own people is secondary. Your first duty is to the entire communist movement, and of course, Moscow got to decide what that meant.
It's a clever way of saying national loyalty doesn't matter as much as loyalty to the Soviet Union.
So the invasion was over, the justification was out there, and now the crackdown began. A long, cold political winter descended on Czechoslovakia, and the fallout from this event would split the entire communist world.
This process they called normalization was swift and systematic. First, they arrested Dubček and the other reform leaders and flew them to Moscow to basically force them to surrender. Then, every single one of the Prague Spring reforms was undone. A new, hardline leader who was loyal to Moscow, Gustav Husak, was put in charge. And then came the clampdown. Over 1,000 Czechs were arrested. The party was over.
And in the middle of all this despair and hopelessness, something truly shocking happened. A student named Jan Palach walked into Wenceslas Square and set himself on fire. It was this final, horrific, desperate act of protest against the occupation. It became this powerful, tragic symbol of all the hope that had been extinguished.
Now, you'd think this might unify the communist world, but it did the exact opposite. It blew it apart. Countries like Yugoslavia and Romania, who were always a bit more independent, openly condemned the invasion. The hardliners in East Germany and Poland, of course, were thrilled. But here's the big one. The powerful communist parties in Italy and France were so disgusted that they broke off their ties with Moscow. This was the birth of Eurocommunism, a version of communism that didn't answer to the Kremlin.
So, you're probably wondering, where was the United States in all of this? The West? Well, the answer is pretty much nowhere. There were strong verbal protests, sure, but no actual help. The U.S. was completely bogged down in the Vietnam War, and they were also trying this new policy of détente, which meant easing tensions with the Soviets. A UN resolution to condemn the invasion was, of course, immediately vetoed by the Soviet Union. The Soviets had made a bet that the West wouldn't risk a major war over Czechoslovakia, and they were right.
Which leaves us with this final thought. The tanks definitely won in 1968. A long, oppressive period fell over Czechoslovakia. But the memory of that brief, beautiful spring never really went away. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? You can crush a movement with force, sure, but can you ever really kill the idea behind it? Or is it just waiting for its next chance?